Well, it's another word in your ear, and surely our first with someone who was with the Beatles and the Maharishi in India, who inspired a hit record, who's just published interviews with 65 musicians and married Mick Fleetwood twice. It's Jenny Boyd. Jenny, fantastic to see you.
Well, hello.
Very nice to see you. We'll come on to your book.
Yeah, quite an introduction.
Yeah, we're going to come on to your book, Icons of Rock, in a moment. But first, just a bit about your early life. So where were you brought up? Was it Guildford? Was that right?
No, in Kenya.
Okay, Kenya, sorry.
Yeah.
It was miles out.
Further away.
Yeah.
No, I was born in Guildford, but my parents moved to Kenya when I was just a few months old. And Patty, my sister, and my brother Colin. And then we had our next, my next sister was actually born in Kenya. So we were there, I think, for my first 6 years.
Right.
When did you move to England then?
When I was six.
When you were 6. And can you remember things like the first records you bought?
Yes. Well, actually, because because Patty was a little bit older than me, she had enough money to go and buy a record. And so it was Bill Haley, See You Later, Alligator. And I just fell in love. I must have been about 7, 8, probably, fell in love with rock and roll. And all I wanted to do was dance. And then Patty and I would start jiving together. And, it was sort of, I just from a very early age knew I loved music and the beat and what it did to you.
Can you remember the first group you saw?
Like live?
Yeah.
The first group I saw actually was a group called the Cheynes. And Mick Fleetwood was the drummer in the Cheynes.
Oh, right. This is Cheynes.
Yes,
that's right.
Cheynes.
I've got a record by them.
You haven't really.
Down the river, something about the river?
I think I've got a record called I Can Tell.
Oh, okay.
It's on a compilation. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And so when I was still going to school, apparently I heard later Mick had said to himself, he'd seen me in the little coffee shop after school with my friends and said, that's the girl I'm going to marry.
Amazing. How old would he have been?
16. We were
16.
Yeah.
And you were what, about 15 or I don't know?
No. They were the same age.
Yeah. Incredible.
Yeah. But my absolute love when I was probably like 10 or 11 was Buddy Holly. There was a girl in our school who used to play guitar, and every break time I'd go and watch her playing her guitar, and it was always every single Buddy Holly song. So, yeah.
So you never took it up yourself? You never attempted to try music yourself?
There's still time, isn't there?
Yeah, of course.
I always have a guitar in the room, or George once gave me a sitar, or I've tried the violin and the piano and every instrument you can imagine, but it doesn't stick. But writing has always stuck with me ever since I was little.
It's funny how different it is with musicians, isn't it, really?
Yeah. They just know it.
They can perceive patterns, can't they, really quickly?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you and me would look at it forever, would never be able to do it.
No.
Right.
I appreciate music and I love to dance.
Right. So you started modeling at what age?
I started modeling, I think I must have been just turned 17. And it was actually, I didn't necessarily want to be a model. It's just that the boyfriend I had then, because Mick and I hadn't got together then, the Cheynes had broken up. And so he was painting Fole and Tuffin, who are the new fashion designers. He was painting their showroom, and they said, well, we've lost our fashion, our model to show clothes, our house model. And he said, oh, I'll ask my girlfriend. I was still at school, so I left school the next day and went to go and have an interview and never told my mother. And they said, oh, yeah, we'd love you to start. And you're just the right size and all this kind of stuff. And so that's how
So you became a professional model from that point, as it were?
From that point, yes. Not photographic yet. I was just the house model. And then after a while, they said, because all the editors of big glossy magazines would come and watch me doing my, showing off the clothes. And they said, oh, we want to photograph Jenny in this or that. And that's how, then I was told, go and get yourself a photographic modeling agency.
Right. So first of all, it was like in the shop, was it basically showing stuff to potential customers?
Not customers, to magazines, to glossy magazines. And then I went to New York, and Patty came as well and showed the Fold and Tuffin clothes. And, it was sort of modeling stuff.
Right. And was that because they were, particularly at that time, they wanted a kind of new look? They wanted a new generation with different haircuts?
Well, they were a generation. I mean, they were a new generation because they had trouser suits and nobody else did, not even Mary Quant. But they were sort of alongside Mary Quant. And I loved the clothes. And they were all made for me. So I was sort of the best dressed 17-year-old probably going, And it was fun. They were great to work with. And I really enjoyed being with them, and then branched out, and everything then took off.
So you completely left school then?
Oh, yeah. I hadn't even mentioned it to my mum, but I don't know if she noticed because she had 6 children. And Patty had probably already left home, and we were in this tiny little place. And so it was probably a relief that, I was kind of about to fly the nest.
Do you ever think that's remarkable, looking back at that, how in the 60s, how parents kind of didn't hover over their children all the time, did they?
You're absolutely right. No. I mean, she never mentioned the fact that I'd left school. She must have gathered it. But you just felt we had the freedom to do whatever we wanted. But when I remember growing up in Africa, there was no parenting there. We were sort of feral, really.
Yeah.
That's what suited us, Patty and me, with the rock and roll world. It was sort of like kids who never really grow up.
So what was your first meeting with the rock and roll world, so to speak?
Well, it was actually a friend of mine at school called Dale had a major crush on Mick. And she said, oh, you must meet this drummer. He's very skinny and tall, and he's just wonderful. And that's when Mick was like 16, 17. And so I went to, it was the coffee, it was called the Coffee Mill in Notting Hill Gate. And I met Mick, and he said, oh, we're going off to go and play a show in Brentwood. And so on Saturday, so do you girls want to come with us? My friend was kicking me under the table. So, we said, yes. But that was my first live performance I'd ever seen with the Cheynes. And I loved it. I'd never seen live music before. And it was sort of a lot of the blues stuff, Muddy Waters and John Lee Hooker. And that was my first.
Right.
So what kind of other people can you remember seeing in the club world, Central London club world?
Well, when Mick and I got together, and Patty and George were together, we'd all go. They would take us, or George and Patty would be going to the Ad Lib or the Crazy Elephant, Scotch of St. James's, and that was wonderful. And that's where you'd see, I'd sit next to Keith Moon or whoever was there. But it was very cool. There was nobody like who can have your autograph sort of thing going on, because you're young and we're all cool. And the music was Motown, because nobody could get Motown in England, but they'd obviously managed to get the Motown records from America. And that was fantastic. That was just, and of course we danced.
Right. So you're dancing, was it just the girls dancing, or the girls dancing with
No, Mick and I would dance together. He was a great dancer. But I would get to the point where I'd grab anybody, because I just loved to dance and I loved the music.
Right. So what was it like, during Beatlemania, having your sister dating George Harrison and being in Hard Day's Night? Was that massively exciting to you, or was it just kind of standard?
No, I think at that age I was more kind of into the sixth form boys and having crushes. But so Patty met George, and the family was, wow, that's fun. And then, but I remember when Patty asked me if I'd like to meet him. She was staying, she was sort of sharing a place with her friend in Chelsea. I remember just being so amazed because he looked so small, really, and sort of so, so sweet and friendly and not at all like a big pop star, because, of course, they look larger than life, of all the in magazines and stuff. And when he came round to our house, he was just very sweet and very normal, just like, Patty bringing her new boyfriend round, except he'd be talking about the tour, the American tour, or about John, or.
And how did your parents react to that?
Well, my mother was living by herself. She was very excited. So I imagine she must have been in her late 30s then, maybe. But I remember, there was sort of excitement about it.
Right.
So when he came to the family home, were people aware that he was there? Were the fans kind of following him and all that kind of stuff?
No, because it was sort of earlier than that, and it was in Wimbledon. It was Wimbledon Park, and it was a line of little houses. I mean, probably a curtain or two might have twitched, because he arrived in his E-Type Jaguar and just parked it outside. But they probably didn't know who was inside.
Yeah.
And you got a job working, didn't you, with Apple at one stage?
Yeah, so what happened is that I went to San Francisco in 1967, beginning of 1967, with no idea about flower power or anything that was about to burst. So I lived there for 6 months and, of course, loved all the music because it was, Janis Joplin in Big Brother and the Holding Company, and there was Jefferson Airplane and all those great San Francisco bands. And I went to the Monterey Pop Festival, and that was the first festival of its time. And then I'd asked Patty and George to come over, that this is incredible here. And then finally when they came over, it was August, and all the good hippies had gone, and all the sort of school kids had been told to tune in, turn on and drop out. So everybody was just mobbed. And it was just a disaster. And I felt rather bad because it'd been my idea for them to come to San Francisco. But they decided I needed to come home. I'd been there 6 months. And so I stayed with them for a while. And that was when Maharishi came to London. And so we all went to go and see him, meet him, and go and listen to what he was saying about.
You went to Bangor, didn't you?
Yeah, then after that, we all went to Bangor.
But at Bangor, that was when the news arrived about the death of Brian, wasn't it?
Exactly.
So how was that? How did you...
That was awful, because we were all sort of on a high, really. We got our new mantra, we were doing our meditation. Maharishi was talking about the Beatles going to India to learn how to be initiators. And then suddenly, bam, this news, and Brian was actually meant to be coming to Bangor. So that was shocking. And in a way, I saw all the paparazzi interviewing them, but Maharishi told them, that they mustn't mourn him, that Brian was happy where he was and all this. So I felt that in a way they had to kind of suffocate those feelings of grief in a way, because now they were meditators. But anyway, so I drove, Patty and I and George, we all drove back together. And as I was getting out, because I was getting out in London, George got out of the car and he said, we'd love you to come to India with us. But India wasn't until February. But meanwhile, I'd been asked to work in the Apple boutique because it was about to open.
All right.
And that was where Donovan came down. And I'd met Donovan before, and he wanted to know about my trip in San Francisco, about Maharishi, and, he was very curious. And then at one point he asked me if I'd like to go over, have lunch with his manager. And that's when he said he'd written a song for me. And he played Juniper for me. And it was very slightly embarrassing because I didn't know where to look. And it obviously meant he'd got a crush on me.
Yes, absolutely. That's pretty forward, isn't it? I've written a song about you.
Yeah, really.
I think your intentions are fairly clear there. Yeah.
So it was a lovely time. And then, in February, I went with Patty and George, and I think John and Cynthia went with us too, to Rishikesh.
Just going back for a second to the song, how did that feel when because that was a bit of a hit, that was on the radio all the time, and how did that feel when that was knowing it was a song about you?
Well, I felt so, I don't know, because I must have been, 18, 19. And I just felt really, I'd never had a song written for me before. And so
Most
I
people
felt
haven't.
flattered. It's sort of embarrassed and flattered.
It's a very
Not quite
select club. Peggy Sue, these various people are actually mentioned in the title. Incredible.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a lovely song, and I've heard it over the years many times, whether it's in a lift, or supermarket, or I hear people who tell me that they've called their daughter after Juniper, after Jennifer Juniper. So it's lovely.
Do you
It's
ever
an extraordinary. Sorry,
do you
go
ever
on.
reflect on it? I mean, you just take that year that you've just described, you going to San Francisco, the beginning of the festivals, George coming, the Maharishi, going to Rishikesh. And that's quite a short period of time, really, isn't it? It's about a year, isn't it, effectively? And people still, we're asking you about it now, and people still write books about it and talk about it and make films about it. Do you ever think that's extraordinary? That was my 19th year or whatever it was,
Yeah, exactly. And when you're that age, or probably any age, you don't think one day this will be a kind of iconic time, do you? It's just going one thing to the next. I was a searcher, I was kind of, I'd had what I experienced, a sort of big awakening before I went to San Francisco. And so we were all kind of on the same page. And in a way, we were looking for some deeper meaning to life. Having been the dollybird and all this kind of stuff, suddenly things changed. And I think it changed for many people. There was a kind of zeitgeist. And that was the whole thing, in San Francisco. It was just a different, there was something happening that was suddenly music became much more important. What Bob Dylan was saying was very important. What the Beatles were saying, all you need is love. Okay, well, that's good. We don't have to search too much further, and it was a time that a lot of people were kind of tuned in with each other.
Tell us more about Rishikesh, because that's an incredible thing to have been involved in. There was you, and there was, I'm trying to think who else was there. Mia Farrow was there, wasn't she?
Yeah, Mia
Donovan,
Farrow.
Mike Love.
Mike Love, yep. And everybody was sort of there for the same reason. So although, our bungalow that we had, the sort of Beatle bungalow, and, Cynthia and Patty and Jane Asher sometimes, and, we'd all sit on the roof of the bungalow while they'd start with their guitars, making up songs. And it was all songs from what was going on. Say if John couldn't sleep, then he'd be singing about, I couldn't, whatever that song was, I couldn't sleep last night. And he'd pick up his guitar and they'd all start playing. Or Dear Prudence was Mia Farrow's sister. Bungalow Bill, everything was what was going on in the ashram. And I think we must have been there about 2.5 months.
That's interesting. So they were doing that in public. I mean, they were sitting there with you and writing songs. They didn't go off in their own to a corner and they did it with an audience, really.
And it was just us, so it was just the three of them. And then, Patty and Cynthia and I just kind of, chatting quietly or doing whatever. And because it was the morning sun, but there was no one sort of standing nearby or having a listen as well. It was private. People were meditating.
I mean, in terms of music, it was, apart from anything else, it was an incredibly fortuitous break, wasn't it? It was effectively off-site 2 months to, you could write a bunch of, a lot of songs. Yes.
I think George recorded something quite a few years later that he'd written in Rishikesh. Yeah. It was an extraordinary time. I could have just lived there forever.
And Magic Alex was out there, wasn't he, I think?
Oh, my God, he was.
What was your feeling? Because he's become a bit of a figure now in the Beatles folklore. A lot of people think it was kind of the one moment they rather took their eye off the ball and let this eccentric and rather unqualified guy in. But what did you think of it?
I thought he was very jealous because John and Cynthia, I rented a room from him in his house just for a little while before I was going away, before I left for India. And John and Cynthia came the night before, and he was trying to dissuade John, saying, "Why don't you go to my guru?" And I think he was very jealous. And I had the feeling when I saw him in India that he'd come to make trouble in some way.
What did you think about the Maharishi incident? I mean, a lot of people thought that was maybe made up and that John just wanted that as an excuse to go home early or whatever. Do you think the Maharishi, was behaved in a kind of
I think
controversial manner?
Is a lot of things all hit at the same time. I think, we'd all been there a long time. And I think, Maharishi I was never a huge fan of Maharishi. I love the meditation, but I think obviously things were going on, and I think probably they were ready to go as well. But I also think that there was a lot of because especially for George and John, they trusted Maharishi, and maybe finally they realized that actually he wasn't who they thought he was. I think it was a shame. But then I know that later on, because when I was living in Los Angeles, George had said he'd seen Maharishi again and they'd sorted things out.
Right. I suppose it's also just a reminder just of how quickly things moved in the 1960s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Whole lifetimes in a year, really.
Exactly.
Compared to nowadays.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary time.
So Fleetwood Mac, the extended family of Fleetwood Mac, lived in this legendary place called Kiln House. Tell us about that.
What happened is that we'd all been out on the road, and that's when Peter Green said that he was leaving. And really shocking news. And I think Mick was the one he was like the pot of glue. He wanted to keep everybody going, even though Peter had left. So it was his idea that we should move into this house, Kiln House, that actually we knew the people who lived there. They moved out. Everybody got rid of their flats in London. And then we lived there as a kind of commune. And there was a space a big room where they could do the playing and rehearsing, because they had an American tour to go to. And it was right at the last minute that they asked Chris if she would join the band. And while we were there, Chris and I, because Peter had been their main songwriter, and Danny Kerwin really struggled with writing songs. So there was one afternoon when Chris and I together, we wrote July Judy. And another time after Kiln House, we moved to a big house called Bennyfolds in Hampshire, where it was the same thing, communal living, and it kept everyone together. Mick was right. And sometimes, the road crew would come and stay there and crash there. It was, I think we were known in the village as rather sort of those people up on the hill in their big house.
Yeah. Well, you with Traffic were kind of pioneers in that whole getting it together in the country type thing, weren't you?
And it worked.
Yeah.
It did. They stayed together for quite a few tours. And then Bob Welch, we met up with Bob Welch from Los Angeles. Then he joined the band. So it was a kind of, going round and round, different people coming and going.
But the time when they moved to America, because you were there for obviously with the time when they met up with Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, but you also saw the kind of difficult time in America and they were trying to get established. What was that like? So the real highs and lows.
Yeah, well, it was difficult because their manager had put on a bogus band and called them Fleetwood Mac. So then they were suing their manager. They couldn't go out on the road, or they couldn't record. I can't remember. I think they couldn't go out on the road till this was sorted out. So they decided that we'd go to Los Angeles, maybe just for 6 months, to see if they could actually make it big. While we were there, and it was hard, there was a lot of sort of legal stuff going on. And then Bob Welch decided he'd had enough. He wanted to leave. And that's when Mick was actually looking for a place to record and came across the sound of Stevie and Lindsey. He found them and they came over to our house. And I remember first meeting them, how fresh they were. It was like sort of definitely, they were very friendly and very open. And when I heard them rehearsing, it was obvious they were going to be huge. There was something about the chemistry of them. and the harmonies. And of course, they were songwriters too. So it was, the perfect combination.
So before that, there must have been times when you sat there and thought, this is never going to happen. They're going to keep banging their heads against the wall. They're never going to be played on the radio or whatever.
No, I never thought that.
You
never
never
thought that.
Really?
No. Ever since I'd met Mick, I knew he was, whatever band he was in, that it was a really good band. Whether Peter Green was in it or whether it wasn't, there wasn't ever, and it's honest truth, even though we had 2 children, that I thought, oh, this is just not going to happen.
Get a proper job. You never thought that.
Get a proper job. Not, well, I've never been asked that question before, actually, but it never occurred to me.
Really? Never?
Yeah, ever.
That's
So
incredibly optimistic.
You had bills to pay and children to look after and so forth.
Somehow it worked out.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe Mick was very relaxed about his attitude to it as well, because the impression I always get is it must be so hard for anyone being, married to a rock musician, because there seem to be kind of 2 gears. One is that they're not appreciated enough and they're worrying about their career. And the other is that they're massively appreciated and everybody in the world wants to talk to them. And it's quite hard to get in. So both those things must be quite hard to manage.
That's right. But they would always tour. I mean, they had a following.
Right.
So when Peter was in the band, they had a following, because I'd go on the road with them in America and, they went down well. They had a following, but it wasn't as big as when Stevie and Lindsay got in there.
Yeah.
No, sure.
And then everything changed.
They are a unique institution, aren't they, Fleetwood Mac? Because the kind of, they're named after the rhythm section kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not the guys at the front. The people at the front have changed.
Yeah.
But the motor has remained those 2 guys at the back.
But that was very Peter Green. He never wanted it to be his name. And because John McVie and Mick were there in the early days, he wanted that to be the name.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of took the onus off him. He was very sort of humble, I think, in that way.
Yeah. See, in your book, you've talked to lots of musicians, and obviously you've known a lot of musicians. You've seen a lot of bands come and go. What have you learned about musicians and rock bands? Is there anything that you think?
Yeah, what patterns emerge?
Yes.
Yeah, what patterns emerge? What was interesting, because there was 70 when I first wrote this book, and there's more people in it in this new version, and there's more off the interviews in this new version. Because I just took snippets out of the interviews for the initial one. What I learned was the things that they had in common is that there was, with all of them, there was this sense of humility, which is interesting because they're on stage and there's lots of room for egos, but there was a sense of humility, and I think a lot of it came down to the fact that if they were writing lyrics, sometimes things would just come through them as if they weren't part of it. And it's what this psychologist, Abraham Maslow, called the peak experience. And so they all kind of, or the muse, it's the same kind of thing, where they all kind of bowed down to that. So they had this humility. They'd all experienced this sort of zone, going into this zone, whether they were playing or whether they were writing music. And what else? The other thing I found with these musicians, they'd all had nurturing. They'd had parents or grandparents who were very nurturing and encouraged their creativity. I did ask them if they thought that we all had the potential to be creative, and they said yes. In some way we all have that.
Well, we do, but not necessarily to write songs of that caliber.
No, in different ways.
Yeah. But I thought all that stuff about creativity was so interesting. And you could argue, actually, the Beatles invented that whole thing. Before that, bands weren't expected to write their own songs. And after that, for better and in some cases worse, they all did, But there are two kind of main attitudes, aren't there? There's the Graham Nash attitude, which talks about not even being aware of where he was when he writes songs. He's so kind of,
Right.
he's like a conduit, receiving these things from above. And then there's a very much more prosaic view of, I think it was Jackson Browne, who talks about the Dylan line, hanging around the inkwell. He said, you can't just sit around waiting for inspiration. You've got to sit down and you've got to work.
Yeah.
And I tend to imagine that actually it's it's the drive that produces the songs.
The drive is enormous.
It's saying, I am like the Beatles, who say, we are going to write songs on Thursday. You know what I mean? And they just would,
Yeah, but some of it is like you're given it. It's almost like, Don Henley was looking for the last line of, I think it was either Boys in Summer, and it was the Deadhead sticker on a Cadillac, and that was right in front of him. So sometimes they feel they're given something, and other times, a lot of it is hard work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a combination.
Well, Mark and I were talking recently about Martin Amis in his autobiography. He talked about literary talent is very often inherited. His father was a writer, but stamina isn't always. And I thought it really interesting part.
Yeah,
to keep doing it.
That the drive is key. But then you have Graham Nash, who said right from an early age, he and his buddy would sing, when they were at school. He knew that they were going to be famous. He just knew it. There was no question.
But also
had a sense of destiny too.
Yeah, there's a sense with some of them that there was absolutely no alternative employment. I think it's Michael McDonald who talks about at the age of 4, singing on bars with his father. He was a performer at the age of 4, and so there was no other option to the course he took, really.
Exactly. I think Stevie Nicks is the same.
Yeah.
That was it. That's what they knew they were here to do.
You've also got the interesting thing that you've obviously had a lot of experience of, which is that these musicians work in these strange little social organizations called bands, which are kind of partly families, partly political parties, partly business arrangements. All these things are all going on all the time, and it's very difficult to hold those things together, isn't it?
Yes, but I think what unites them is when they're on stage and they play together, the connection that they have is worth everything.
So they're prepared to put up with, personal tensions and so forth for that.
To a point, I would say, but yes.
Right. You must have been in the room when there's been some terrible inter-band bust-ups, surely.
No.
Never.
Come to think of it, no.
Oh, really?
I didn't know what was going on.
You could kind of feel tensions.
Yeah.
Right. It's always been my theory that with bands that they've always got unresolved tensions because they never talk about anything.
But who knows whether those tensions then get released into sort of really creative energy.
Right.
Could be part of it.
Well, I think it might have been the section on Eric Clapton. You talk about how turmoil is the trigger. I think for him, it was emotional stress was often what inspired him to write songs. Would that be true of a lot of people, do you think?
Probably. I'm trying to think of anybody else. Yeah, I'm sure. That's all part of the drive, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's self-expression. And it's, you think of the Rumours album, everything that was going on then. That created that album, really. Everybody busting up and then coming with somebody else. And then, it's that created that huge album to be such a success.
But they were in a sort of unique position, really, of so much success that there was so much dependent on their remaining together that they would put up with unbelievable tensions and difficulties in order to, for the sake of the common good,
Right.
I mean, any other band with less success would have split up straight away, I'm sure.
That's it. And I'm sure they still had that buzz, when they were actually playing on stage.
Did you ever feel personal resentment at the kind of at the amount of attention on them?
Well, only in as much as, because I was the only one that had children.
Right.
And so it meant that often we didn't see Mick for a long time. He'd, still be in Hollywood. They'd be in, still recording or this or that. And, that's cocaine came in a big way at that time too. It was kind of dripping off the walls in every studio. And so there was that. And so as a mother to two small children in a different country, there was that sort of feeling sometimes. I was pleased for them, like really pleased for Mick, but I think it's hard. If I hadn't have had children, it would have been different.
Right. I can imagine. So yours were the only children in the kind of orbit of that. Really?
Yeah. And
that's quite unusual, really.
Very unusual.
And, sometimes the kids would come to the studios, sometimes, and obviously when I'd be on tour, they'd be on tour with me and they'd have their little bags of colors and things to paint or whatever for the flight. And they just toured. They knew what it was like to tour. But I was the one with kids, and you can't keep kids quiet the whole time. So I always had that slight pressure. It was different.
God, it sounds impossible, actually, to me, taking kids on a tour. I think it must have been so difficult, really.
Well, it was in the early days because we had to drive from place to place, before sort of when we were living in England. And it was really, pretty basic.
Yeah. So this book, as you say, you did a kind of earlier version quite a few years ago, didn't it? I mean, how were these interviews? How did you get them? Was it just happening to be with people and say, let's just have a quick chat about
originally this, when I did it was 35 years ago. It's between 1988 and 1990, and it was say for Joni Mitchell, that I knew the manager. Excuse me. And so it was easy to get pretty much everybody I got, either because my second husband played with Crosby, Stills and Nash, Bonnie Raitt, Dylan, just a whole lot of people. So I knew how to get hold of those people and ask them, and they were all totally into it and very.
What did you tell them that you were looking for particularly? Because when you're interviewing somebody, obviously they want to know what direction it's driving in.
Yeah, well, I said because it was a PhD dissertation to begin with, and I said what I'm trying to find is the connection between creativity and spirituality, because I believe there is a connection, and so they were really up for it. And of course, easy getting George, and once they knew probably got about 15, it was pretty easy, and then after that, when they found out who else had been interviewed,
they want to be in it.
They want to be in it suddenly. It's always the same. Yeah, once you say, I've got so-and-so in the bag.
Oh, then I must.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But it's great because with this book, say the interviews with Joni, in fact, there's 8 of them that I've got where I've got the whole interview that had never been heard or seen of before. They were just kind of squirreled away for all those years.
Right.
So, but the majority of those people you knew, I guess, were there some that you'd never met and you just wanted to include them?
Hey, John Lee Hooker.
Yeah.
I'd not met him before. Buddy Guy. There were lots I hadn't met before. Some, Peter Gabriel, I had to do over the phone because he was in England and I was living in LA. So, yeah.
And who were you particularly impressed by?
Joni Mitchell was a great interview. Very eloquent. Don Henley was a really good interview too.
Yes, he's very good. There's a bit in the Don Henley interview where he talks about how they get calls at his office from people who say they were married to him or that they're the mother of his children or whatever. And you thought, oh my God, who would possibly want this life with that kind of misery going on?
Yeah, that was interesting. I think because when I was actually transcribing them, before for this book, there were a lot of things that I'd forgotten about because a lot I hadn't even listened to for so long. And it was just so inspiring. I think I felt really inspired by everybody.
It's very interesting that if you ever listen to a really old interview you did, you listen to it with completely fresh ears. If you hear it 20 years later, there's things you miss very often.
Yep.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. And then with this book as well, I got some new people because I wanted it to be shown the difference between the music world then, 35 years ago, and how it compares to now.
And how
So
is
that's
that?
What did you conclude?
Well, we've got Spotify, which makes it a whole completely different. People aren't so reliant on record companies. Social media.
Mhm.
I think it was Atticus. Someone said if the Beatles came today, would they be as famous? Maybe they wouldn't have that many followers. And, it's just so different. And
There's
also trying to get.
I think it's Egg White. There's a very good interview with Egg White, the songwriter. I think it's him that says that in the world of Spotify, said there's no such thing as loyalty. I thought that was really interesting because all the people you interviewed in the early days were people who had loyal followings, who put up with them even through a succession of bad albums. They stuck with them, But now there's that loyalty. Just the moment you hear something you don't like, say, I'll switch off and listen to somebody else. That's made a big difference, isn't it?
It's huge. Yeah. Yeah, and much harder for musicians to actually be able to make money from their recordings.
But how do you?
Everybody has to tour.
How do you feel though when you've known that kind of 60s and early 70s generation so well and watched them become absolutely enormous and so forth? How do you feel? How do you respond when you look at somebody like Taylor Swift, who's just incredibly successful?
Yeah.
And you wonder, how long can she do that for? Do you ever think about that?
No, because I'm not so involved in the sort of, younger generation of musicians. Some, yeah, but I don't, because there's so many, and I come across, some, Adele, of course, was an obvious when she sort of was really sort of big, and I'm sure she probably still is big. But having new sounds, I'm not so up on that. But Jacob Collier, who I interviewed in the book, and I went to go and see him play in Bristol, and I was just amazed, the energy and everything about him. I did see Graham Nash just recently playing in Covent Garden. And beautiful, although it was a shame that, David Crosby died, but the two people that he had with him, they still did these harmonies that were just gorgeous.
I thought the Graham Nash interview was one of the best in the whole book, actually. I thought he was terrific.
Did you?
He talks about looking at the cracks in the ceiling and his bedroom ceiling as a child and how his imagination would kind of run from that. And then a very sweet thing about the death of John Lennon, he said one of the saddest things about the death of John Lennon was that all the songs that John Lennon was going to write that we would never hear, which I thought was a very interesting point, something that he'd be halfway through and something he hadn't even started, Yeah.
And yet there's the new song that they've got that just came from a little bit of John playing a piano.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't remember what it's called.
Now and Then.
Do you think there was a golden age in looking back on that all the periods you were writing about? Was there one particular time that was your favourite for any reason?
I loved the 60s. I loved all that real rock and roll stuff, just Jerry Lee Lewis. And I think, I don't know, it'd be good to ask someone who's really like my granddaughter, who's 18, what does she listen to? And the interesting thing, she did say, you ought to check out Phoebe Bridgers. Right. And I thought, oh, great idea. But trying to get hold of her, I got hold of her mum, but, and Phoebe was very keen. But because now they don't have just a manager, they have a team.
Everybody's got people. Everybody's got people. If you hear the expression, I have to talk to his people, forget it.
Yeah.
It'll never happen. That's right.
No way. No.
Once there's that many people involved, no decision can ever be made.
No.
So tell me, you've got an 18-year-old granddaughter. How would you feel if she left school or college or whatever and went to live the life that you went to live when you were 17 or whatever?
Hey, go for it, I'd say.
But then again, she's your granddaughter, not your daughter's. So your responsibility isn't that acute.
Right. One. Yeah. In fact, she's very musical too. So it comes out.
But it does seem amazing that you're allowed to do the things you were allowed to do in this day and age.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Everybody's so much more hands-on. don't know, with their children, and it's different.
Oh, we
Unless
should
it's
ask
our
you.
partner, I think.
I just forgot. We forgot to ask you about Mick Fleetwood. You married him twice, didn't you?
Yes, it sounds romantic, but it wasn't.
It wasn't.
We needed to get green cards.
Oh,
Right.
The first time I've told anyone.
oh, okay.
We were still friends, it was tricky. It was a kind of rocky time. But the great thing is we're still great friends. So,
Yeah.
Right.
and we can laugh at things.
Well, look, it's been
And he's
terrific.
done a nice little sort of piece in the audiobook, just just recently. So, yeah.
Very good. Oh, it's been lovely talking to you.
There's the book.
There it is. Icons of Rock.
In Their
Yes.
Own Words by Jenny Boyd.
Yeah.
Out
Yeah.
now.